August 25, 1931. The city of Gaoyu, China. It's 2 a.m. You're sleeping in your second-floor room when you hear it. A sound like thunder, but constant, getting louder. You rush to the window. A wall of water 50 feet high is racing toward the city. The levees have broken. You have maybe 60 seconds. You grab your children. Run upstairs. The water smashes through your front door like an explosion. It rises 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet in minutes. Your house is underwater. Your neighbors' houses are underwater. The entire city is underwater. Between 10,000 and 15,000 people drown in a single night, just in one city. But Gaoyu is just one disaster in a catastrophe that covers an area the size of England. 3 major rivers, the Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai, have all overflowed simultaneously, flooding 180,000 square kilometers of central China. 25 million people are directly affected. At least 145,000 drown in the immediate floods. But over the next year, between 2 and 4 million people will die from starvation, disease, and exposure. This is the 1931 China floods, the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history. And chances are you've never heard of it. Subscribe right now if you want real history, the kind that changes how you see the world. Hit that bell. Tell me in the comments, did you learn about the 1931 China floods in school? I'm betting 99% of you didn't. Because despite being the single deadliest natural disaster in human history, more deaths than any earthquake, tsunami, hurricane, or volcanic eruption ever recorded, it's almost completely unknown in the West. Why? Partly timing. This happened during the Great Depression when Western countries had their own crises. Partly distance. China was remote, mysterious, hard for Western journalists to access. Partly politics. China was in the middle of a civil war and Japan was about to invade. But mostly, we just didn't care. For million Chinese peasants dying in floods wasn't news in America or Europe. Well, it should have been. Because what happened in China in 1931 makes every other natural disaster look small by comparison. Let's go to central China in early 1931 and watch the worst year in modern human history unfold. To understand how this happened, you need to understand Chinese river systems. The Yangtze River is the longest river in Asia, 3,900 miles from the Tibetan Plateau to the East China Sea. It flows through the most densely populated regions of China. In 1931, an estimated 200 million people lived in the Yangtze River basin. That's more than the entire population of the United States at the time. The Yellow River, Huanghe, was called China's sorrow because it flooded constantly. It carries massive amounts of sediment, more than any other river on Earth, which raises the riverbed and makes flooding inevitable. The Huai River sits between the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, connecting them through a complex network of canals and tributaries. All 3 rivers flow through the North China Plain, the agricultural heartland of China. This region produced most of the country's rice, wheat, and other crops. And all 3 rivers were disasters waiting to happen. Why flooding was inevitable. 1. Deforestation. Centuries of logging had stripped hillsides bare. Without tree roots to hold soil, rainwater ran off immediately instead of being absorbed. This caused flash flooding and erosion. 2. Sediment buildup. The Yellow River especially carried tons of sediment. It would deposit this sediment in the riverbed, raising the water level year after year. Eventually, parts of the Yellow River flowed above the surrounding land, held in place only by levees. 3. Poor infrastructure maintenance. China had been building and maintaining levees, dikes, and flood control systems for thousands of years. But by 1931, the system was falling apart. Why? Because China was in chaos. China in 1931. The Qing dynasty had collapsed in 1911. The Republic of China was established, but it was a government in name only. From 1916 to 1928, China was divided among warlords, regional military strongmen who controlled different provinces and fought each other constantly. In 1927, the nationalist government, Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek began trying to reunify China. But they were fighting the Communist Party in a brutal civil war. Meanwhile, Japan was eyeing Chinese territory. They'd invaded Manchuria in September 1931, right in the middle of the flood crisis. So when the floods came, China had no centralized government with real authority, no budget for infrastructure maintenance, no coordinated disaster response system, all resources devoted to civil war. The levees and dikes along the rivers, which required constant maintenance, had been neglected for decades. Sediment hadn't been cleared. Weak points hadn't been repaired. The system was ready to fail. It just needed the right conditions. And 1931 provided them. Winter 1930 to 1931. The previous winter had been unusually harsh. Heavy snowfall in the mountains. When spring arrived, the snow melted rapidly, sending huge volumes of water into the rivers. Spring 1931. Usually, China's central region experienced gradual warming and moderate rainfall in spring. But 1931 was different. Heavy rains started in April. Not the usual seasonal showers, torrential downpours. Day after day, week after week. By June, people living in low-lying areas were already abandoning their homes. The rivers were higher than normal spring levels, and summer hadn't even started yet. Summer 1931. Then came July. In July 1931 alone, 9 cyclones hit central China. The normal average is 2 per year. 9 in 1 month. For weather stations along the Yangtze River recorded over 600 millimeters, 24 inches, of rain in July alone. The water kept rising, and rising, and rising. August 19, 1931. The Yangtze River at Hankou, in Wuhan, reached its peak. 16 meters, 53 feet, above normal levels. To put that in perspective, that's as tall as a 5-story building. The entire city was underwater. The water level was nearly 2 meters higher than the Shanghai Bund, the elevated waterfront promenade in Shanghai, which was designed to be above any possible flood. The 3 rivers, Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai, all flooded simultaneously. This had never happened before in recorded history. Individual rivers flooded regularly, but all 3 major systems at once? Unprecedented. The floods covered 180,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of England and half of Scotland combined, or New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut combined. But these weren't empty lands. This was the most densely populated agricultural region on Earth. How the floods killed. Phase 1. The immediate drowning, July-August. When the levees broke, and they broke in dozens of places, the water came fast, sometimes without warning. The August 25th breach at Gaoyu killed 10,000 to 15,000 in a single night. People drowned in their beds, in their homes, running through streets. Bodies floated everywhere. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Official reports say at least 145,000 to 150,000 people drowned in the immediate floods. But that's almost certainly an undercount. Many rural villages were completely submerged. Nobody survived to report how many died. Phase 2. The stranding, August-November. The floods didn't recede quickly. The water stayed. For months. Major cities like Wuhan and Nanjing were underwater. Not ankle deep. We're talking 10 to 15 feet of water in city streets. In Wuhan, 200,000 refugees crowded into whatever buildings still stood above water. They were stranded. No food, no clean water, no sanitation. People climbed to rooftops, sat there for days, weeks, waiting for rescue that didn't come. Phase 3. The starvation, September 1931 to 1932. The floods destroyed the summer rice harvest. Completely. Rice fields that covered hundreds of square miles gone. Swamped. The rice drowned in standing water. Grain storage facilities were flooded and destroyed. The stored grain from previous harvests, the emergency supply, ruined. When the water finally receded in late fall, it was too late to plant winter crops. The ground was still saturated. Farmers had no seeds. Many had no tools, everything had been washed away. This meant there would be no food for at least a year. 25 million people suddenly had no food source. Cities like Wuhan and Nanjing depended on rice from the surrounding countryside. When the countryside produced nothing, the cities starved. Contemporary accounts describe horrific scenes: people eating bark from trees, families selling children for food, widespread cannibalism, eating the dead, infanticide, killing babies they couldn't feed, women sold as brides or prostitutes for a bag of rice. One witness reported seeing children with faces of old men, starving so badly that their features had become skeletal. Phase 4. The disease, 1931 to 1932. Stagnant floodwater became a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery spread rapidly. The polluted water gave everyone who drank it severe diarrhea, which led to dehydration and death, especially in children and elderly. Typhoid fever swept through refugee camps. Contaminated water. No sanitation. Bodies decomposing in the water supply. Cholera broke out in September 1931, particularly in Wuhan. The official report recorded 31,974 deaths from cholera alone between May 1932 and early 1933, with over 100,000 cases. But that's just the reported cases. The real numbers were probably much higher. Refugees crowded into camps had abnormally high infant mortality. Translation: babies died by the thousands. One medical report noted, the incidence of gastrointestinal diseases was very high in every camp, and there was no medical help. China's already weak healthcare system was overwhelmed. They didn't have enough doctors, medicines, or supplies even for normal conditions, let alone a disaster affecting 25 million people. So how many people actually died? That's where it gets complicated and disturbing. Official Chinese government report, 1933, 2 million deaths total. 140,000 to 150,000 drowned. The rest from starvation, disease, and exposure. Western estimates at the time, 3.7 to 4 million deaths. Why the discrepancy? The Chinese government had political reasons to downplay the disaster. They were trying to maintain legitimacy while fighting a civil war, trying to attract foreign investment, embarrassed by their inability to respond effectively. Reporting 4 million deaths would have been admitting catastrophic governmental failure. Western observers, journalists, missionaries, relief workers, were on the ground and saw the devastation firsthand. Their estimates were consistently higher. Modern historical consensus, 2 to 4 million deaths. Most historians now accept 3.7 million as the most probable figure. To put that in perspective, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, 230,000 to 280,000 deaths. The 2010 Haiti earthquake, 100,000 to 316,000 deaths. Hurricane Katrina, 2005, 1,836 deaths. All U.S. combat deaths in World War II, 405,399. The 1931 China floods killed more people than all of these disasters combined. In fact, the casualties from the 1931 floods alone are nearly equivalent to all global deaths from natural disasters between 1974 and 2003 combined. One single event. And it's not just the immediate deaths. It's what came after. The refugee crisis. An estimated 40 million people were left homeless. Think about that number. 40 million. That's more than the entire population of California. Where did they go? Nowhere. There was nowhere to go. Some fled to major cities like Shanghai and Nanjing, creating massive refugee camps. But the cities couldn't handle the influx. They didn't have housing, food, or jobs for millions of desperate people. Many just wandered, became seasonal workers, a euphemism for refugees with no homes and no resources. Contemporary reports describe abnormal movement of so-called seasonal workers, who are actually refugees, with low organic resistance due to partial starvation and exposure. These refugees carried disease. They brought cholera and dysentery to areas that hadn't been flooded. The economic devastation. The Yangtze River Basin produced most of China's rice. The region's economy was almost entirely agricultural. With the crops destroyed, the economy collapsed. No food to sell. No income for farmers. No tax revenue for the government. Roads were washed out. Bridges destroyed. Railways damaged. The infrastructure that connected China's interior to its coast gone. Businesses along the rivers, trading houses, warehouses, mills were destroyed. Years of accumulated wealth vanished overnight. The government response. It was pathetically inadequate. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was barely functioning. They were fighting a civil war against the communists. Japan had just invaded Manchuria in September 1931. They had no money, no resources, and very little administrative capacity. Initial relief efforts were chaotic and uncoordinated. Local officials tried to help, but they had no supplies, no funding, and no support from the central government. The government did eventually set up the National Flood Relief Commission. But it was too little, too late. International relief. Charity poured in from around the world, but it wasn't nearly enough. Overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia sent money. They were the most generous donors. In the United States, Pearl S. Buck, the famous author who'd lived in China for decades, wrote short stories to encourage donations. She later wrote The Good Earth, 1931, which dealt partly with floods and famine. It became a bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize. The League of Nations, precursor to the UN, called for international assistance and warned about the epidemic danger. Eventually, the U.S. government provided a large loan of wheat and flour. But the relief effort was crippled by the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in autumn 1931. The Chinese bond market collapsed. International investors pulled out. The government couldn't secure loans. The people who needed help never got it. The superstition angle. Here's a disturbing detail. Just before the floods, the Kuomintang government, as part of an anti-superstition campaign, demolished a Dragon King temple in Wuhan. The Dragon King is a traditional Chinese deity associated with rain and water. Destroying his temple right before catastrophic flooding was unfortunate timing. Many locals believed the floods were the Dragon King's revenge. After the disaster, prominent officials, including the mayor of Wuhan and the local garrison commander, held public ritual ceremonies, kowtowing to the Dragon King deity to appease him. Meanwhile, the floods created fatalism. A contemporary report noted, thousands are convinced that Hankow Wuhan is doomed and refuse to help themselves or be helped. They sit stoically awaiting death. When people believe disaster is divine punishment, they don't evacuate. They don't seek help. They just wait to die. This fatalism made the disaster worse. So why don't we learn about this in the West? 1. Timing. 1931 was the Great Depression. The U.S. stock market had crashed in 1929. By 1931, America had 25% unemployment. Europe was in economic collapse. Western countries were dealing with their own crises. Chinese floods weren't a priority. 2. Distance and access. China in 1931 was remote from a Western perspective. Very few Western journalists had access to the flooded regions. The areas worst hit were rural, inland provinces. No major Western press presence. No photographers. No film crews. Compare that to, say, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which happened in a major American city with extensive press coverage. The China floods? Mostly reported secondhand, through missionary accounts and Chinese government statements, which underplayed the disaster. 3. Political chaos. China was in the middle of a civil war. The government was barely functional. Japan invaded Manchuria in September 1931, right during the flood crisis. Western countries were more focused on Japanese aggression, which threatened Western business interests, than on flood victims. 4. Racism and Orientalism. Let's be blunt. Western media in the 1930s didn't value Chinese lives the way they valued white Western lives. For a million Chinese peasants dying in a flood wasn't relatable to American or European audiences. There was also a pervasive attitude that disasters in China were expected. That's just how things are over there. This is the same era when Western countries had explicitly racist immigration laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act was still in effect in the U.S. Britain treated China as a semi-colonial territory. 5. It wasn't dramatic enough. This sounds horrible, but it's true. Slow-motion disasters don't make headlines the way sudden catastrophes do. An earthquake that kills 100,000 people in one day gets more media attention than a flood that kills 4 million over a year. The 1931 floods had no single dramatic moment. It was gradual rising water weeks, then drowning, spread over months, then starvation spread over a year, then disease spread over another year. Each phase was a slow horror. There was no moment for newspapers to photograph and sensationalize. Compare that to the Titanic, 1912. 1,500 deaths in one night. Massive international coverage. Still remembered today. Or the Hindenburg disaster, 1937. 36 deaths. But dramatic explosion caught on film. Still famous. The China floods killed 10,000 times more people than the Hindenburg. But there's no iconic photo. No dramatic moment. Just millions of people slowly dying in floodwaters and refugee camps. 6. China's own historical amnesia. Even in China, the 1931 floods aren't as prominent in national memory as you'd expect. Why? Because worse things came after. The Japanese invasion, 1937 to 1945, millions dead in war crimes. The Chinese Civil War, 1945 to 1949, more millions dead. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, estimated 15 to 55 million dead from famine. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, 1 to 20 million dead. The 20th century was so catastrophic for China that the 1931 floods, despite being the deadliest natural disaster in history, are just one horror among many. Could it have been prevented? Partly, yes. The floods themselves were natural: extreme rainfall, cyclones, snowmelt. You can't prevent weather. But the death toll? That was preventable. What went wrong? 1. Infrastructure neglect. The levee and dike system that had protected central China for centuries was falling apart. Maintenance required constant funding and labor. China's government, weak and distracted by civil war, didn't maintain it. 2. Deforestation. Centuries of logging had stripped hillsides bare. This increased runoff and erosion. Reforestation programs could have helped. But that requires long-term planning and resources China didn't have. 3. No disaster preparedness. China had no coordinated disaster response system. No emergency food reserves. No evacuation plans. No warning systems. When the floods came, local officials improvised. Most did nothing. 4. Government dysfunction. The central government was barely functional. Regional warlords controlled many provinces. There was no unified command. Disaster relief requires coordination. China had none. What happened after 1931? In the immediate aftermath, the government proposed flood control projects. In 1919, plans for the Three Gorges Dam had been suggested. A massive dam that could control Yangtze River flooding and generate hydroelectric power. But construction didn't begin until 1994, 63 years later. The dam was completed in 2006. Why the delay? Civil war, Japanese invasion, communist revolution, political chaos. China didn't have the stability or resources to build massive infrastructure until the late 20th century. In 1954, the Yangtze flooded again. Not as bad as 1931, but still catastrophic. That renewed calls for the Three Gorges Dam. In 1998, another major Yangtze flood killed thousands and affected 240 million people. Modern studies comparing the 1931 and 1998 floods note that while the 1998 flood was meteorologically smaller, it could have been worse if not for improved infrastructure and disaster response. The lesson: infrastructure matters. Government capacity matters. Disaster preparedness saves lives. But 1931 still stands as the worst. Modern scientists studying the 1931 floods note that the rainfall was not the largest in history, but was characterized by unprecedented persistence. It wasn't that any single storm was record-breaking. It was that the rain never stopped, week after week, month after month, and the flood control systems, weakened by decades of neglect, couldn't handle it. Climate scientists studying the 1931 floods today are concerned. Why? Because climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme rainfall events globally. The same meteorological conditions that caused the 1931 floods, persistent heavy rainfall, multiple cyclones, are becoming more common. China has massively improved its infrastructure since 1931. The Three Gorges Dam, modern levees, early warning systems, disaster response capabilities. But climate change is escalating the threat faster than infrastructure can adapt. In 2020, the Yangtze Basin experienced severe flooding again. Not as bad as 1931, but bad enough to displace millions and cause billions in damage. The Three Gorges Dam, designed to prevent catastrophic flooding, nearly reached its maximum capacity in 2020. Engineers were genuinely worried. Some scientists argue that if 1931 level rainfall happened today, even with modern infrastructure, the death toll could be catastrophic. Not 4 million modern early warning and evacuation would prevent that, but potentially hundreds of thousands. And it's not just China. River basin flooding is a global threat. The Mississippi River Basin in the U.S., the Ganges-Brahmaputra Basin in India and Bangladesh, the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia, the Amazon River Basin in South America. All of these regions have hundreds of millions of people living in flood-prone areas. And climate change is making extreme rainfall more common everywhere. The 1931 floods should be a warning. They show what happens when infrastructure is neglected, governments are dysfunctional, disaster preparedness is inadequate, climate creates extreme conditions. All of these factors are still relevant today in different ways but still relevant. Between 2 and 4 million dead, most likely 3.7 million, 40 million homeless, an area the size of England completely submerged. The deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history, and most people in the West have never heard of it. That's not an accident. It's a choice, a century of choosing not to remember, not to teach, not to care about millions of Chinese peasants dying in floodwaters. But we should remember, because the 1931 China floods teach us. Lesson 1. Infrastructure matters. Neglected levees and dikes killed millions. Lesson 2. Government capacity saves lives. China's dysfunctional government couldn't respond effectively. Lesson 3. Disaster preparedness is essential. China had no warning systems, no evacuation plans, no emergency response. Lesson 4. Extreme weather events can kill on unimaginable scales. We think of modern disasters as catastrophic, but 1931 dwarfs them all. Lesson 5. We forget what doesn't affect us personally. 4 million dead, but they were far away, so we moved on. The 1931 floods aren't ancient history. They're a warning about what can happen when nature, infrastructure failure, and governmental dysfunction collide. And with climate change intensifying extreme weather globally, that warning is more relevant than ever. So here's my question. Why do you think we've forgotten this disaster? Is it because it happened in China? Because it was too slow and gradual to be dramatic? Or because we just don't care about disasters that don't affect the West? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story opened your eyes to history you never learned, if you're shocked that the deadliest disaster in human history isn't taught in schools, subscribe, hit that bell, and share this with someone who needs to know. Because 3.7 million people died in 1931. The least we can do is remember them. Until next time, remember that history isn't just what we're taught. It's also what we've forgotten, and what we've chosen to forget.